May 13th, 1888. The morning sun casts long shadows across the grand staircase of the Imperial Palace in Rio de Janeiro. A solitary figure ascends the steps with measured grace. Princess Isabel, the daughter of Emperor Pedro II and Regent of Brazil. In her hands, she carries a document that would forever alter the destiny of millions. The Golden Law. The weight of history rests in those few sheets of paper, representing not just the end of slavery in Brazil, but the culmination of decades of struggle, resistance, and transformation. What many don't realize is that this momentous signature was far more than a simple stroke of the royal pen. Behind this historic moment lay a complex web of international pressures, particularly from Britain, which had long sought to end the slave trade in the Atlantic. The story encompasses the fierce resistance from powerful plantation owners who saw their economic empire threatening to crumble, and the unwavering determination of abolitionists who had fought tirelessly for decades to reach this day. In the streets below the palace, a palpable tension hung in the air. Brazil stood as the last Western nation to maintain legal slavery, a dubious distinction that had become increasingly untenable in the modern world. The coffee plantations of the Paraíba Valley, the sugar mills of the Northeast, and the bustling ports of Rio and Salvador all had been built on the labor of enslaved people. Now, everything was about to change. This watershed moment was the culmination of a struggle that had begun long before. It was a story of secret societies and clandestine meetings, of brave journalists who risked everything to speak truth to power, and of enslaved people who had never ceased fighting for their freedom. The abolitionists, both black and white, had worked tirelessly through legal channels and underground networks, slowly but surely building momentum toward this decisive day. As Princess Isabel prepared to sign the law, she knew she was not just ending an institution. She was fundamentally reshaping Brazilian society. The signature she was about to place would send ripples through every facet of Brazilian life, from its economy to its social fabric, creating consequences that would echo through generations to come. This was more than a legal document. It was a new beginning for Brazil, though one that would bring its own challenges and complications in the years to follow. As we delve deeper into this remarkable story, we'll uncover the hidden truths behind Brazil's path to abolition. We'll meet the brave men and women who fought against the odds, explore the international pressures that helped force change, and examine how this pivotal moment continues to influence Brazilian society today. This is not just a story of the past, it's a key to understanding the Brazil of today and tomorrow. This story will reveal the hidden truths behind the abolition of slavery in Brazil. Ring the bell now, enjoy the video, and subscribe to the Modern Age Chronicles channel, and join the thousands of historical researchers who are already uncovering the deepest secrets of our history. In the grand tapestry of Brazil's abolition movement, several remarkable figures stand out as architects of change, each bringing their unique strengths and perspectives to the cause of freedom. Princess Isabel emerges as a fascinating and complex figure in this historical drama. As regent of Brazil, she found herself walking a delicate tightrope between the conservative plantation-owning elite who formed the backbone of the empire's economy and the growing chorus demanding the end of slavery. Though often portrayed simply as the signatory of the Golden Law, her position was far more nuanced. She faced intense pressure from her aristocratic peers who warned of economic collapse, while simultaneously dealing with the mounting international embarrassment of Brazil's position as the last Western nation to maintain slavery. Her decision to sign the Golden Law would earn her the nickname the Redemptress, though it would also contribute to the fall of the monarchy just a year later. José do Patrocínio stands as one of the most powerful voices of the abolitionist movement. A brilliant journalist and orator, he turned his newspaper Cidade do Rio into a formidable weapon against slavery. Born to a slave mother and a priest father, Patrocinio understood intimately the injustices of the system he fought against. His words thundered through the streets of Rio de Janeiro, inspiring both the elite and the common people to join the abolitionist cause. His ability to craft compelling narratives about the horrors of slavery and the promise of freedom made him one of the movement's most effective advocates. André Rebouças brought a unique perspective as a black engineer who had achieved prominence in Brazilian society. His position as a respected professional and intellectual allowed him to move freely among the elite, while never forgetting the cause of his enslaved brothers and sisters. Rebouças used his connections and expertise to argue that slavery was not just morally wrong, but economically inefficient. He developed detailed plans for land reform and the integration of freed slaves into the workforce, though many of these progressive ideas would sadly go unimplemented. Joaquim Nabuco represented the conscience of the Brazilian aristocracy. Born into privilege, he chose to use his position and education to fight for abolition. His work, O Abolicionismo, became the intellectual foundation of the movement, arguing that slavery corrupted not just the enslaved, but the entire society that maintained it. Nabuco's international connections and diplomatic skills were crucial in building foreign pressure on Brazil to end slavery. His ability to articulate the abolition cause in terms that appealed to the elite made him particularly effective in changing minds among his own social class. Perhaps most remarkable is the story of Luis Gama, who transformed himself from an enslaved child sold illegally by his own father into one of Brazil's most effective champions of freedom. Teaching himself to read and eventually becoming a lawyer, Gama used his legal knowledge to free hundreds of enslaved people through the courts. His intimate understanding of both the legal system and the horrific realities of slavery made him an especially powerful advocate. He developed legal strategies to challenge illegal enslavement and became known as the Black Rui Barbosa, referring to one of Brazil's most famous jurists. Together, these individuals formed a powerful coalition that approached the fight against slavery from multiple angles: legal, journalistic, intellectual, and social. Their different backgrounds and approaches complemented each other, creating a movement that could speak to all levels of Brazilian society. While Princess Isabel might have signed the final document, it was the relentless work of figures like Patrocinio, Rebouças, Nabuco, and Gama that made that signature possible, each contributing their unique talents to the cause of freedom. Their legacy extends far beyond the abolition itself, as they not only fought to end slavery, but also grappled with questions of citizenship, equality, and justice that continue to resonate in Brazilian society today. Their stories remind us that social change requires diverse voices and approaches, working in concert toward a common goal. Step into the vibrant and complex world of 19th century Brazil, where the struggle for abolition played out against a backdrop of dramatic contrasts and rapid change. Let me paint you a vivid picture of this transformative era. In the bustling streets of Rio de Janeiro, the capital of the Brazilian Empire, elegant mansions with their neoclassical facades and wrought-iron balconies lined the fashionable neighborhoods. The city pulsed with activity as merchants hawked their wares from colorful stalls, while ladies in European-style dresses and gentlemen in formal black coats navigated the narrow cobblestone streets. Street vendors, many of them enslaved or recently freed, called out their offerings of fruits, sweets, and fresh bread, their voices mixing with the clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages and the distant toll of church bells. The coffee plantations of the Paraíba Valley presented a striking contrast to the urban landscape. Here, vast estates stretched as far as the eye could see, their neat rows of dark green coffee trees climbing the hillsides like soldiers in formation. The imposing plantation houses, known as Casas Grandes, stood as symbols of wealth and power, their white walls gleaming in the tropical sun. Behind these grand facades, hundreds of enslaved workers toiled in the fields from dawn to dusk, picking the precious coffee berries that fueled Brazil's economy and filled European cups. Hidden in the depths of Brazil's forests and mountains, quilombos served as havens of freedom and resistance. These communities of escaped enslaved people created their own societies, combining African traditions with indigenous knowledge to survive and thrive. The most famous, Palmares, had fallen in the previous century, but numerous smaller quilombos dotted the landscape, their existence a constant reminder of the unquenchable human desire for freedom. They maintained complex networks of communication and support, often aided by sympathetic abolitionists in the cities. In the ornate salons of Rio's elite, politics and social change were debated beneath crystal chandeliers and gilt-framed mirrors. These spaces, with their imported French furniture and fine Persian carpets, hosted intense discussions about the future of slavery. Here, abolitionists like Joaquim Nabuco would engage in passionate debates with conservative plantation owners, while ladies sipped tea from fine porcelain cups and discussed the latest Parisian fashions. These salons served as crucibles where new ideas about freedom and progress challenged old notions of social order and economic necessity. The ports of Brazil told their own story of change. Once teeming with slave ships, by the 1850s, these harbors were patrolled by British warships enforcing anti-slavery treaties. The sight of Brazilian naval vessels turning away illegal slave traders marked a visible shift in the nation's relationship with human trafficking. The ports remained busy, but now increasingly with ships carrying European immigrants, manufactured goods, and the coffee that had become Brazil's golden crop. This was a world of stark contrasts. Between the refined urbanity of Rio and the brutal reality of the plantations, between the freedom of the quilombos and the constraints of slavery, between the progressive discussions in elite salons and the conservative forces fighting to maintain the status quo. The air was thick with the tension of a society on the brink of fundamental change, as the old order of slavery confronted the rising tide of abolition. In the streets, churches, markets, and homes, people of all classes and colors lived out their daily lives against the backdrop of this momentous transformation. The sights, sounds, and smells of this period, from the aroma of coffee roasting in the port warehouses to the sound of political debates echoing through marble halls, created the sensory landscape of a nation grappling with its greatest moral and social challenge. This was the Brazil of the 1880s, a nation poised between past and future, tradition and change, slavery and freedom. Every corner of this complex society would be touched by the coming transformation, as the country moved step by step toward the momentous day when Princess Isabel would sign the Golden Law and legally end centuries of institutionalized bondage. The path to abolition in Brazil was not a sudden transformation, but rather a carefully orchestrated series of legal reforms spanning nearly 4 decades. Let's explore this fascinating journey that forever changed Brazilian society. The story begins in 1850 with the Eusebio de Queiroz Law, a watershed moment in Brazilian history. Under intense British pressure and the threat of naval intervention, Brazil finally took decisive action to end the Atlantic slave trade. This law wasn't just a piece of paper. It represented Brazil's first serious step toward ending its dependence on enslaved labor. The impact was immediate and dramatic. While approximately 50,000 enslaved people had been brought to Brazil in 1849, this number plummeted to less than 700 by 1852. However, this didn't end slavery itself. Instead, it created an internal market where enslaved people from declining sugar regions were sold to the booming coffee plantations. 2 decades later, in 1871, came the Free Womb Law, Lei do Ventre Livre, a clever political compromise that marked the beginning of gradual abolition. This law declared that children born to enslaved mothers would be free, though they would remain under the care of their mother's owners until age 21. While celebrated as progressive, the law's impact was complex. These free children often lived in conditions virtually identical to slavery, and the long wait for actual freedom created a generation caught between slavery and liberty. Nevertheless, the law sent a clear message. Slavery in Brazil had an expiration date. The sexagenarian law of 1885, Lei dos Sexagenarios, represented another calculated step toward abolition. This law freed enslaved people over 60 years old, though it came with significant caveats. Critics pointed out that few enslaved people survived to such an advanced age, and those who did were often too worn down by decades of forced labor to enjoy their freedom meaningfully. The law also required freed individuals to provide 3 more years of service as compensation to their former owners, revealing the persistent power of the plantation-owning class. Finally, on May 13, 1888, Princess Isabel signed the Golden Law, Lei Áurea, making Brazil the last Western nation to abolish slavery. The law was remarkably brief, just 2 articles long, but its impact was seismic. With a single signature, approximately 700,000 enslaved people were legally freed. The moment was met with widespread celebration in the streets, but the joy of liberation would soon face harsh realities. The immediate consequences of abolition were profound and often painful. Freed people found themselves without land, education, or resources. Many former plantation owners, refusing to pay wages to their former enslaved workers, opted to import European immigrants instead. This led to a massive displacement of the newly freed population, who often migrated to cities, forming the first favelas. The lack of any government program to integrate former enslaved people into society as citizens created social and economic disparities that would persist for generations. The long-term consequences continue to shape Brazil today. The decision not to provide land or compensation to freed people contributed to lasting economic inequality. The preference for European immigrants over freed black workers reinforced racial hierarchies. The absence of educational opportunities for former enslaved people and their descendants created barriers to social mobility that would prove difficult to overcome. Yet the abolition also set in motion positive transformations. It sparked the emergence of black political and cultural movements, contributed to the growth of Brazil's urban working class, and eventually led to the recognition of Afro-Brazilian contributions to national identity. The struggle for full equality and opportunity continues, but it builds upon the foundation laid by those crucial decades of gradual emancipation. Each step in this journey, from the end of the slave trade to the final abolition, tells a story of resistance, negotiation, and transformation. They remind us that major social changes often come not in a single moment, but through a series of hard-fought victories, each incomplete, but building toward a larger goal. The effects of these decisions continue to reverberate through Brazilian society, making this history not just a tale of the past, but a key to understanding contemporary Brazil. What began with the Eusebio de Queiroz law in 1850 set in motion changes that would fundamentally reshape Brazilian society, economy, and culture. While the Golden Law of 1888 marked the legal end of slavery, the real work of building a more equitable society had only begun, a project that continues to challenge and inspire Brazilians to this day. It's impressive how every detail of this story affects us to this day, isn't it? Leave your opinion in the comments about how abolition impacted Brazil today, and take the opportunity to leave your like and subscribe to the Modern Age Chronicles channel. Let's discover together the mysteries that changed the course of our history. Let me take you into the shadowy world of conspiracies and secret operations that swirled around Brazil's abolition movement, where hidden forces shaped the course of History. Britain's role in ending Brazilian slavery was far more complex than simple diplomatic pressure. While officially Britain claimed humanitarian concerns, their motivations were deeply economic. After abolishing slavery in their own colonies, the British needed to eliminate the competitive advantage that slave labor gave Brazilian products, particularly sugar and cotton. The British Navy's aggressive anti-slavery patrols in Brazilian waters, sometimes violating Brazilian sovereignty, were as much about economic warfare as moral crusading. Secret documents from the period reveal that British agents infiltrated Brazilian society, gathering intelligence about slave trading operations and even funding local abolitionists. Operating in the shadows, secret abolitionist societies formed intricate networks throughout Brazil's urban centers. These groups used codes, passwords, and elaborate initiation ceremonies to protect their members and operations. They maintained hidden safe houses for escaped enslaved people and operated underground printing presses to produce anti-slavery literature. One particularly fascinating aspect was their use of quilombos as part of an early underground railroad system, creating escape routes that stretched from the coffee plantations to remote free communities. The Caifases movement, led by Antonio Bento in São Paulo, represents one of the most daring chapters in this hidden history. This clandestine group specialized in organizing mass escapes from plantations, often using elaborate schemes to outwit slave owners. They would pose as traveling salesmen or religious pilgrims to make contact with enslaved people and plan escapes. The Caifases developed a sophisticated communication system using coded messages in newspaper advertisements and even created false documentation to protect freed slaves. Their operations were so effective that some plantations lost hundreds of workers in a single night. The plantation owners' resistance took equally secretive forms. They maintained their own intelligence networks, employing spies to infiltrate abolitionist groups and using their influence to suppress anti-slavery activities. Some evidence suggests they operated a shadow banking system to continue financing illegal slave trading, even after it was officially banned. They also used their connections in the government to delay enforcement of anti-slavery laws and to protect slave hunters who illegally captured freed people. Perhaps most intriguing is the role of Masonic lodges in the abolition movement. The Freemasons provided crucial support to abolitionists, using their extensive networks to share information and resources. Many key abolitionists, including Joaquim Nabuco and Rui Barbosa, were Masons. The lodges served as safe meeting places where abolitionists could gather without arousing suspicion, as Masonic membership crossed social and political lines. Some historians believe that certain Masonic symbols were used as secret markers on safe houses and escape routes. A particularly fascinating aspect was the use of ritual and symbolism in these secret operations. The Caifases, for instance, would often time their liberation operations to coincide with religious festivals, using the cover of celebrations to move large groups of escaped enslaved people. Abolitionists developed elaborate systems of hand signals and coded phrases, some of which were adapted from Masonic traditions. The intersection of these various secret networks created a hidden war beneath the surface of Brazilian society. British agents might work with local abolitionists who were also Masons, while plantation owners' spies tried to infiltrate these same groups. This clandestine struggle often played out in unexpected ways, at elegant dinner parties where coded conversations took place behind fans and in seemingly innocent social gatherings that served as cover for planning sessions. Some mysteries from this period remain unsolved. There are still questions about the full extent of British intelligence operations in Brazil, the possible involvement of other foreign powers, and the existence of documents that might reveal the true scope of the plantation owners' resistance networks. Several key abolitionists disappeared under mysterious circumstances, their fates unknown to this day. The role of the Brazilian imperial family adds another layer of intrigue. While Princess Isabel is celebrated for signing the Golden Law, some historians suggest she was part of a complex web of secret negotiations involving the Masons, the Church, and various political factions. There are indications that the timing of abolition was carefully orchestrated to balance multiple competing interests. This hidden history reminds us that great social changes often depend not just on public actions, but on countless secret operations, unsung heroes, and complex networks operating in the shadows. The full story of how Brazil achieved abolition may never be completely known, but these glimpses into its clandestine aspects help us understand the true complexity of this historic transformation. Let me take you through the compelling documentary evidence that tells the story of Brazil's journey to abolition, pieced together through various historical sources that survive to this day. The private correspondence between abolitionists provides some of our most intimate insights into the movement. Letters exchanged between figures like Joaquim Nabuco and André Rebouças reveal not just their strategic planning, but their personal struggles and hopes. In one particularly moving letter from 1887, Rebouças writes to Nabuco, "The wheels of justice turn slowly, my friend, but we must push them forward with all our might." These letters often used coded language to protect sensitive information about escape routes and safe houses. Some correspondences were written in invisible ink or contained hidden messages in seemingly innocent social commentary. The abolitionist press played a crucial role in shaping public opinion, with O Abolicionista leading the charge. This newspaper, founded in 1880, became the movement's most powerful voice. Its pages contain not just editorials and news, but also detailed accounts of slave conditions, escape stories, and legal arguments against slavery. José do Patrocinio's fiery editorials in Cidade do Rio would often cause such controversy that copies would sell out within hours. These newspapers also served as a communication network for abolitionists, with seemingly innocent classified ads often containing coded messages about upcoming actions or warnings about slave catcher activities. The official imperial documents provide a fascinating glimpse into the bureaucracy of abolition. Provincial reports detail the growing tension between law and practice as various anti-slavery laws came into effect. Custom House records show the dramatic drop in slave ship arrivals after 1850, though suspicious gaps in these records suggest continued illegal trading. Police reports from the 1880s reveal the authorities' conflicted role, sometimes pursuing escaped enslaved people, sometimes turning a blind eye to abolitionist activities. Manumission records, Cartas de Alforria, tell deeply personal stories of individual paths to freedom. These documents, preserved in municipal archives, show various ways enslaved people gained their freedom through purchase, conditional agreement, or owner's will. Some records reveal entire families working for years to buy freedom, one member at a time. The conditions attached to many of these documents paint a picture of continued control even after nominal freedom was granted. For instance, one 1882 carta required the freed person to work for their former owner for an additional 5 years without pay. Perhaps the most powerful visual evidence comes from the photographs of Mark Ferrez. His images capture both the grandeur and the contradiction of 1880s Brazil. His famous photograph of enslaved workers on a coffee plantation, taken around 1885, shows not just their working conditions, but their dignity in the face of oppression. Ferrez's street scenes of Rio de Janeiro document the changing urban landscape where enslaved, freed, and free people interacted daily. His technical mastery and artistic eye preserved crucial details about clothing, tools, and social interactions that written documents might have missed. Court records provide another crucial source of evidence. Legal cases, particularly those argued by Luis Gama, show how abolitionists used the law itself as a weapon against slavery. These documents reveal various legal strategies, from challenging the legality of individual enslavements to arguing broader constitutional points about human rights. Parish records offer yet another perspective, documenting baptisms, marriages, and deaths of enslaved people. These records sometimes provide our only glimpse into family relationships that slavery tried to destroy. They also show how the Church's position on slavery evolved over time, with some priests becoming active abolitionists, while others continued to defend the institution. Financial records from plantations and slave trading companies provide cold numerical evidence of slavery's economic impact. Account books show the monetary value assigned to human lives, while shipping manifests reveal the brutal logistics of the trade. These documents also track the economic panic that gripped the plantation sector as abolition approached. Diplomatic correspondence, particularly between Brazil and Britain, reveals the international pressure for abolition. British consular reports detail their agents' observations of continued slave trading after it was officially banned, while Brazilian diplomatic replies show increasing frustration with British intervention. Personal diaries and memoirs, both from abolitionists and plantation owners, provide intimate perspectives on the period. One plantation owner's diary from 1887 reveals growing anxiety about the future. "The world we knew is slipping away, and I fear what will replace it." Meanwhile, abolitionist memoirs detail the dangers and triumphs of their clandestine activities. Together, these documents form a complex mosaic of evidence that helps us understand this crucial period in Brazilian history. Each piece adds detail to our understanding of how slavery ended and why its legacy continues to influence Brazilian society today. These historical records not only tell us what happened, but help us understand the human dimension of this momentous transformation. Let me weave together a comprehensive analysis of abolition's lasting impact on Brazilian society, followed by some fascinating what-if scenarios that challenge our understanding of this historical moment. The abolition of slavery triggered a massive rural exodus that fundamentally transformed Brazil's urban landscape. Freed people, facing hostility from former owners and lack of economic opportunities in rural areas, migrated to cities in unprecedented numbers. Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo saw their populations swell dramatically. With no government support or urban planning, these newly freed individuals settled on hillsides and marginal areas, creating the first favelas. The Morro da Providência in Rio, established in 1897, became the first of these informal settlements, setting a pattern of urban development that would shape Brazilian cities for generations to come. The replacement of slave labor with European immigrants represented a deliberate policy choice with far-reaching consequences. The Brazilian government actively subsidized European immigration while providing no support to former enslaved people. Between 1890 and 1914, approximately 1.5 million European immigrants arrived in Brazil, dramatically changing the country's demographic composition. This policy reflected and reinforced racist ideologies of whitening the population, while simultaneously excluding the newly freed black population from economic opportunities. The economic impact varied dramatically by region. The coffee-growing regions of São Paulo, already transitioning to immigrant labor before abolition, adapted relatively quickly and continued to prosper. However, the sugar-producing Northeast, more dependent on slave labor and lacking capital for modernization, experienced a sharp economic decline that would last for decades. This regional economic disparity contributed to internal migration patterns that continue to shape Brazil today. Labor relations underwent a fundamental transformation, though not always in progressive ways. The transition to wage labor was uneven and often exploitative. Many former enslaved people found themselves trapped in debt peonage systems or working for subsistence wages under conditions barely better than slavery. The lack of education and training programs for freed people created a legacy of occupational segregation that persisted for generations. The failure to address the fundamental inequalities created by slavery allowed structural racism to become deeply embedded in Brazilian society. This manifested in multiple ways. Educational disparities, as freed people and their descendants were effectively excluded from quality education. Occupational segregation that confined black Brazilians to lower-paying, often informal work. Residential segregation that pushed black communities into peripheral areas with limited infrastructure. The persistence of racist attitudes masked by the myth of racial democracy. What if abolition had happened gradually? A more gradual abolition process, properly implemented with support systems in place, might have allowed for better preparation of both freed people and the economy for the transition, development of education and training programs, creation of more stable labor markets. However, it might also have prolonged suffering and allowed plantation owners to adapt their systems of control. What if there had been a reparations program? A comprehensive reparations program could have provided capital for freed people to start businesses or acquire education, funded community development and infrastructure in black communities, created generational wealth transfer to counter centuries of exploitation, potentially avoided the formation of favelas and extreme urban poverty. What if freed people had received land? Land distribution to freed people, similar to the American concept of 40 acres and a mule, could have created an independent black farming class, prevented the massive urban migration and favela formation, generated intergenerational wealth within black families, fundamentally altered Brazil's patterns of land ownership and social structure. These alternative scenarios highlight how different policy choices at the moment of abolition might have created a very different Brazil today. The failure to implement such measures has had lasting consequences, contributing to persistent inequalities that continue to challenge Brazilian society. The impact of these historical choices resonates through Brazilian society today in patterns of inequality, urban development, labor relations, and racial dynamics. Understanding these impacts and considering alternative scenarios helps us better comprehend both the achievements and limitations of abolition as a transformative moment in Brazilian history. The historical legacy of slavery and its abolition continues to profoundly shape contemporary Brazilian society in ways both obvious and subtle. Let's explore this enduring impact across multiple dimensions of Brazilian life. The formation of modern Brazilian society bears the indelible marks of the abolition period. The lack of support for freed people created patterns of social stratification that became deeply embedded in Brazil's social fabric. The concentration of land ownership, the urban-rural divide, and the racial composition of different social classes can all be traced back to decisions made during and immediately after abolition. This period established social hierarchies that, while no longer legally enforced, continue to influence social mobility and opportunity. Perhaps the most visible legacy is the persistence of social inequalities. Contemporary statistics tell a stark story. Black Brazilians are disproportionately represented in poverty statistics, have lower average incomes, face higher unemployment rates, and have less access to quality education and healthcare. These disparities are not random, but rather the direct result of how abolition was implemented without supporting structures for freed people. The intergenerational transmission of poverty, particularly affecting descendants of enslaved people, demonstrates how historical injustices continue to shape present realities. In recent decades, movements for historical reparations have gained increasing prominence in Brazilian society. These movements go beyond simple monetary compensation to demand recognition of historical injustices, investment in black communities, educational initiatives about slavery's legacy, preservation of black historical sites and cultural heritage. economic development programs targeted at descendant communities, land rights for Quilombola communities. The influence on Brazilian cultural identity has been profound and complex. Brazil's national identity is inextricably linked to its African heritage, visible in music, samba, maracatu, and other forms, religion, candomblé and other Afro-Brazilian faiths, cuisine, the strong African influence in Brazilian cooking, language, the significant contribution of African languages to Brazilian Portuguese, arts, the celebration of Afro-Brazilian artistic expressions. However, this cultural embrace often exists alongside continuing social exclusion, creating what some scholars call the Brazilian paradox, the celebration of Black culture alongside the marginalization of Black people. The debate over affirmative action represents one of the most visible contemporary manifestations of abolition's legacy. The implementation of racial quotas in universities and public service has sparked intense discussions about the nature of racial identity in Brazil, the best ways to address historical inequalities, the relationship between race and class, the role of the state in promoting racial equality. These policies have achieved significant results, with a marked increase in Black and mixed-race students in higher education, though they continue to face resistance from some sectors of society. The legacy of abolition also manifests in ongoing debates about police violence and racial profiling, access to quality education, housing discrimination, labor market discrimination, political representation. These contemporary issues cannot be fully understood without recognizing their historical roots in the abolition period and its aftermath. The ways in which Brazilian society commemorates and discusses abolition have also evolved. While May 13th remains an important date, Black movement activists have increasingly emphasized November 20th Black Consciousness Day as a more meaningful celebration of Black Brazilian history and resistance. This shift reflects a broader re-evaluation of how Brazil remembers and interprets its past. Looking forward, Brazil continues to grapple with questions of how to address these historical legacies. Recent initiatives include educational reforms requiring the teaching of African and Afro-Brazilian history, programs supporting Black entrepreneurs, efforts to increase representation in media and politics, recognition and protection of Quilombola land rights, cultural preservation projects. The legacy of slavery and abolition in Brazil remains a living history, continuing to shape debates about identity, justice, and the nation's future. Understanding this legacy is crucial not just for historical knowledge, but for addressing contemporary challenges and building a more equitable society. Thank you for joining us on this remarkable journey through one of Brazil's most crucial historical moments. As we've seen, the impacts of abolition continue to shape Brazilian society today. What aspects of this history surprised you the most? How do you see these historical legacies playing out in contemporary Brazil? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more fascinating historical revelations from Modern Age Chronicles.